My name is Joshua Wu, and welcome to Tax Litigation Essentials today. We thank you so much for joining us for this presentation, and thank you, of course, to Canopy for having me here and inviting me to talk on this interesting topic. So what we're going to be covering today is essentially Tax Court 101. For those of you who have not litigated in the tax court before, we're going to give you a sense of sort of what you need to know, what you need to advise your clients about, what the experience is going to be like, and the ways in which they can prepare their case best for success in the tax court. Now, many of you are hoping probably to never have to go to the tax court, but just in case, I think it's always important to give a client a sense of what they could face if an audit goes bad. So with that, let's go into our presentation here. So by way of background for me, just so you know, I routinely litigate cases in the U.S. Tax Court, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, and the various other district courts around the country. My practice mostly focuses on federal tax, controversy, and planning, but I work with a bunch of other tax lawyers who do all kinds of other substantive areas of tax. And that's one of the benefits of being a generalist and doing a lot of controversy is I do have people that I can always talk to, as I'm sure many of you do, when you get to a really technical issue that you just don't quite have the answer to. So always helpful to have that expertise on a litigation team if you end up going to court and having to litigate a matter. So what we're going to cover today is we're going to go through a little bit of background on sort of what is the tax court, how does it differ from other courts that are in the United States, especially the refund forums, because those are avenues where you can take tax cases to the district courts, to the Court of Federal Claims, as opposed to going to the tax court. So we'll talk also a little bit about why is the tax court better, why is the tax court worse, when are the circumstances under which you might want to go to one of the refund forums as opposed to going to the tax court. Then we're going to get into sort of going to the court. What is it? What's involved? How do you get there? Because the tax court is a little bit unique. You can't take any case there. Only very specific cases can actually go and proceed in front of the tax court. We'll then talk about pre-trial practice, so sort of how to get ready for a trial. And the beauty of that, why that's important, is a lot of cases, probably, at least in my experience, over 80% of cases will settle in the pre-trial phase. And so having a good pre-trial strategy can actually resolve the case before trial. We'll talk about some other pre-trial matters, discovery devices, other motions that you can file, and then we'll actually go right into trial and appeal. So a little bit of background about the U.S. tax court. The tax court's established under Article 1 of the United States Constitution, which is different than the district courts, which means it is a court of what we'll call limited jurisdiction, meaning some courts, like the district courts, they can hear anything. They're courts of what's called general jurisdiction, meaning any case that comes in, criminal, civil, drugs, RICO, they can hear all of it. The tax court is not that kind of a court. They have very specific jurisdiction to tax matters, and even then, only to very specific types of tax matters. The tax court's composed of 19 presidentially appointed judges. They do have to go through the Senate confirmation, and in fact, there are always judges, in most cases, going through the process because judges retire, they take senior status, and so keeping a full bench is a constant process which the government goes through. The judges, unlike most federal judges, the judges are not appointed for life. So most of you probably took your general government class, you know federal judges are generally appointed for life. That's not true with the tax court. It's actually 15-year terms. Every year there are over 30,000 cases filed in the tax court. So when you compare that to the other judicial forums, meaning the district court and the Court of Federal Claims, for tax cases, they average about 1,000 combined. So when you're talking about proportion between the tax court and the refund forums, as I'll call them, the tax court hears so many more cases than the other courts, even though there's multiple other courts. The other thing to remember about the tax court is it is a national court, which means even though the court physically and the 19 judges and their staff are located in the District of Columbia in Washington, they travel circuit, meaning they go out all around the country to different courthouses, federal courthouses, and they hear cases all around the country. So, and they cover most of the what I call mid to big cities in the U.S., including Hawaii. And so You can have a case tried in DC in tax court, or you can have a case tried locally where the taxpayer resides. So it's a very flexible court with respect to that. Now, the tax court judges tend to be experts in tax law. So unlike a district court judge who's a generalist, or even a court of federal claims judge who is a generalist in hearing claims against the government, the tax court judges I believe all of them have a very tax-focused background. So, for example, Judge Ronald Book was a long-time tax partner at a law firm called Bingham & McCutcheon, very prestigious firm. He served in KPMG's National Tax Office. He taught at Georgetown. In fact, when I was younger, I had one of his classes as a student. Excellent professor. And so that's typical of the bench, right? You get very experienced judges with a lot of technical expertise, but who also understand the procedural aspects of the tax law, meaning the rules of evidence, trial practice, and things like that as well. So the tax court does have what's called a chief judge. He or she is elected by the regular judges, meaning the 19 presidentially appointed judges, and the person serves a 2-year term. The chief judge has responsibilities of supervising the administrative functions of the court, but also assigning judges to various trial locations, and also reviews the opinions of all the other judges to ensure consistency. The tax court, the judges do collaborate on many cases, and that is a unique aspect of the tax court. There's also something called special trial judges. So these judges are not those 19 presidentially appointed judges that I talked about before, but they are actually appointed by the chief judge. So the chief judge, in addition to his or her sort of administrative role, also has the ability to appoint special trial judges. What do special trial judges do? Well, they basically resolve small tax cases. So a small tax case is one in which the amount of deficiency is below $50,000. So you're talking about the small taxpayer cases, substantiation cases, maybe some small collection matters. Those can be considered small tax cases, or sometimes designated S cases. So opinions issued by the court. There's several different types of opinions the tax court can issue, and this becomes important when you are researching and trying to figure out how strong is my client's position. What similar cases can I use to support my client's case if we can't resolve this with the IRS and we have to go to tax court? So a bench opinion is what I would call the lowest level of opinion. It can be issued during a regular or a small tax case during the trial session. That's basically one where the judge orally states his or her opinion in open court during the trial session. And it's recorded on the transcript of what happened during the session, and then you can see a copy, the taxpayer gets a copy of what the judge basically said. A summary opinion is issued in small tax cases, so those $50,000 and less cases, dollar amount issue cases. Those opinions are written, so they're not oral, but they cannot be relied upon as precedent, and the decision cannot be appealed, meaning you can't go to a court of appeals for a summary opinion, and other taxpayers cannot use it. They can't cite it in a brief or cite it to the court and say, this is the precedent, this is the legal precedent I'm using to support my case. A tax court opinion or a memorandum opinion, those are precedents. So you can rely on those as precedent in a tax court case. Then you've got the tax court opinions, and that's where if you have looked up opinions before, you see the TC site, T.C. That means it's a tax court opinion. That's usually issued when the court believes, or the chief judge believes, that there's an important legal issue or principle that needs to be decided. And those, of course, can be cited as legal authority. For the tax court opinion, what's different about those than the other types of opinions is that the entire court will review it. And so you can have dissents. In other words, the judge that tried the case, that's physically sat there with the taxpayer and tried the case, might want to go one way. And let's say it's a full tax court decision, and the rest of the court reviews it and says, you know what, we think actually, based on the law, it should go the other way. And so the opinion of the court may actually be of the other judges, not the one who actually tried the case, and that judge could dissent, in other words, disagree with the court's opinion. So that's very unique, almost like a court of appeals. It's the only trial court I'm aware of in the federal system that conducts itself like that. All right, so who can represent taxpayers? Both attorneys and non-attorneys can represent parties before the tax court. Again, one of the few federal courts where that is the case. If you're an attorney, you must be barred in a state, meaning because it's a federal court, if your client's in Tennessee and the tax court's coming to Tennessee, you don't have to be barred in Tennessee as long as you are barred in a state and you are admitted to practice before the U.S. tax court. If you are not an attorney, you're a CPA or enrolled agent, you must pass a written test in order to practice before the tax court. So let's talk a little bit about jurisdiction. All right, so this is why the tax court is different than most federal courts. It's a court of limited jurisdiction. So you have to first know when you're helping a client who's maybe been through an IRS exam and maybe through administrative appeal, and they're thinking, okay, what do we do next? The IRS is denying our position, has assessed tax interest and penalties, or we've gone through a collection due process hearing and they've basically denied our CDP. What do we do? Where can we go? And the question becomes, can we go to tax court or do we have to go to a different court? So first you say, okay, do we have jurisdiction for the tax court? Well, if you've got income, estate, gift, and certain excise taxes, and you've got a notice of deficiency, you've got a pretty good chance of having jurisdiction in the tax court. Okay, so the tax court's sort of bread and butter cases are what we call deficiency cases, meaning when the IRS issues a statutory notice of deficiency, or also called a 90-day letter, and says, this is the amount that we believe, the deficiency that we believe should be assessed against the taxpayer. What it says in the statutory notice of deficiency is you have 90 days to file a petition in the tax court. So once you get that statutory notice of deficiency, that's also called the ticket to the tax court. The taxpayer has 90 days to file a case in tax court. If they don't file it, then you've got a problem, and they may not be able to go to tax court. In fact, they likely will not, and they'll have to go to a different forum, but they may have to prepay the tax that's due. All right. In addition to the classic deficiency cases, penalties. So other types of tax penalties, those can also be heard by the tax court as well. TEFRA partnership cases. So for those of you who don't know what TEFRA is, it's the unified partnership audit regime for certain large partnerships. Of course, this has been replaced by the Bipartisan Budget Act, centralized partnership audit regime starting this year. But the court has jurisdiction over both the TEFRA cases of the past and the new centralized partnership audit regime cases of the future. Declaratory judgments, also something the taxpayer can make. They can make judgments that basically make a statement of fact and law. Disclosure cases, so where there's a dispute about whether or not the IRS must disclose information to the taxpayer, the tax court has jurisdiction for those as well. Cases involving denial of costs, denial of litigation costs or attorney's fees, where that becomes an issue. The court can review those as well. Interest abatement. The tax court actually, interestingly, has exclusive jurisdiction, which means they're the only court that can review an IRS refusal to abate interest that's attributable to unreasonable errors and delays by the IRS. So there's a provision in the code that allows the abatement of interest where the IRS has basically made an unreasonable delay in performing some kind of ministerial or managerial act. The tax court is the only one that can actually adjudicate that in a court of law if the IRS does not appropriately abate the interest. All right. Relief from joint and several liability, that's referring to innocent spouse. So where you've got a married filed joint return and one spouse is the quote innocent spouse and is trying to break that joint and several liability, the tax court has jurisdiction to hear those claims. Collection due process hearing review, the tax court has jurisdiction to review a collection due process or CDP determination. And so if you go through the CDP process and you don't get a result that you are looking for, the taxpayer can appeal that decision to the tax court. All right. In addition, employment status tax cases. So those are independent contractor employee cases involving whether or not the classification of a worker. Instead of a notice of deficiency in those cases, typically what you get is a notice of determination of worker classification. And that is your quote-unquote ticket to the tax court for an employment classification status type of case. Equitable recoupment, I'm going to go through some of these real quick. Whistleblower cases, foreign tax credit adjustments. Again, not that the court doesn't see many of these, although I will say whistleblower claims are probably going to go up as the new Tax Reform Act has liberalized that to some extent. But if you have a whistleblower client who files a whistleblower claim and is entitled essentially to 30% of what the government collects from the party they blew the whistle on, so to speak, from a tax standpoint, if the IRS denies that claim, you can take that to tax court. And there are many cases in tax court regarding whistleblower claims.